All right, welcome to everyone who has joined so far. Just a reminder that as an attendee, you are in listen only mode and your video is turned off. And also welcome to everyone who's joined us on Facebook Live as well. We're going to get started here in a little less than 2 minutes. As we are waiting to get started though, I'm going to start with a short video about domesticshelters.org just to share a little bit more about what the website does and who we serve.
There are over 10 million online searches each month for information regarding domestic violence in just the US and Canada. Anyone, regardless of gender, sexuality, race, or religion, can experience abuse. Domestic abuse isn't always physical violence. It can be emotional, verbal, even financial. It can feel isolating and hopeless. For victims, it often takes several attempts to escape an abusive partner. There are many reasons victims are often afraid to reach out for help, including embarrassment or denial, being isolated from family and friends, or fear of losing their children. But if you're experiencing abuse, you're not alone. It's not your fault. Help is here for you. domesticshelters.org is the leading domestic violence online resource where abuse victims and survivors can find everything they need to take steps towards safety, all in one place. With domesticshelters.org's searchable database of domestic violence programs and shelters in the US and Canada, anyone can find a nearby trained advocate who cares, along with support and resources. Victims of abuse may not be ready to connect with an advocate yet, but with domesticshelters.org's comprehensive library of relevant and high-quality content, it's simple to find information that can help change lives for the better. Domestic violence professionals and advocates rely on domesticshelters.org for ways to better support their local communities through free online expert-led training, award and grant programs, donation tools, and other powerful resources. The profound impact of domestic violence hurts everyone. Victims lose hope. Children suffer lifelong trauma. Communities are permanently damaged. That's why millions of people come to domesticshelters.org to get the answers and help that they need. And why 8 out of 10 domesticshelters.org visitors share their newfound knowledge with others, exponentially increasing public awareness of abuse. Your support helps connect those millions of victims and survivors of domestic violence with the resources they need to identify, escape, and heal from abuse. If you aren't sure where to turn, we're here to help you feel safe again, wherever you are on your journey. Please visit us at domesticshelters.org.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Ashley Rumschlag, and I am the CEO and president of Teresa's Fund and domesticshelters.org. I am joined today by our senior digital services specialist, Rachel Myers, who will be monitoring the chat and Q&A throughout the presentation. We are so excited today to be hearing from Rachel Ramirez with the Ohio Domestic Violence Network about traumatic brain injury, strangulation, and domestic violence. We are expecting a full house of around 1,000 attendees today, so if someone on your team isn't able to join, please ask them to visit our Facebook page where we will be streaming this presentation live. We'll also be monitoring the comment section, so if they have any questions, we will see those there. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All right, we do have live closed captioning available for today's presentation. To make sure that this is enabled, click More in the menu bar and select Show Subtitles. We'll also provide a transcript within 1 week of the presentation. Oh, sorry about that. We'll go the right way here. All right, and just a reminder that all attendees are in listen-only mode, so your microphone and your camera are turned off. You can use the Q&A box to ask questions to our presenter today, and then chat can be used to communicate with other attendees. Just a chat reminder, we do anticipate there will be a lot of conversation in the chat today. We know that can sometimes be distracting. Just a reminder that you can turn off the chat and the chat notifications. On the Zoom toolbar, find the chat button and then click the little up arrow next to the word chat, and then you'll uncheck the box for show chat previews option. To close the chat box, just simply click the X in the chat window. And then just a reminder, we will email a certificate of attendance, a transcript, a webinar playback recording, and additional resources within a week of the presentation. And then also, we will be hosting our Purple Ribbon Award celebration. Our judges just wrapped up the judging yesterday, or actually, yes, 2 days ago now. And so we will be announcing those winners very soon via email. And then we'll have our celebration to announce the winners of the $30,000 in grants on Thursday, May 18th. So Rachel Myers is going to drop a chat or a link in the chat to register for that event. And then just a reminder that we have additional training available. We just looked today, we have 40 different webinars available on our webinars website. So visit domesticshelters.org/webinars and check out a variety of the different webinars we have in the past, two of which Rachel Ramirez, our presenter today, was gracious enough to present back in 2020 and 2021. If you need certificates of attendance for those, you can email us at info@domesticshelters.org. There's the email address. It's info@domesticshelters.org, and we can direct you to where you can download a certificate of attendance. All right. And just really quickly, a huge thank you to Cap60 for making this event possible today. As you may know, Cap60 is the #1 software for victim services agencies. Using their fully encrypted system, you can easily input and access each client's sensitive information. When it comes to reporting, seamlessly export all client demographics, services, unduplicated client counts, and other key metrics to satisfy funder requirements. Some of the additional perks of the Cap60 solution include victim and offender tracking, a centralized intake process, shelter and transitional housing automation, outreach and volunteer management, hotline call tracking, counseling and legal silos, and all funder reports, including VAWA, VOCA, VIPSVA, and the CAPA report. Stick around after the webinar if you'd like to see a demonstration of their software and learn more. Okay, I am so glad to welcome Rachel back to talk about this. Oh, excuse me, I'll get to the right slide here so you can see her name and information here. So we're so glad to welcome Rachel back to talk about this critical issue to such a large audience. I've known Rachel for a few years now and have had the privilege to hear her speak on this topic on many occasions, including 2 webinars with domesticshelters.org from a couple years ago. And we'll drop a link to those in the chat for anyone that would like to see those. As Rachel will share, this information is critical for all those working with victims and survivors of abuse. And it's truly a hidden epidemic that we must start paying attention to. So welcome, Rachel. So thankful to have you here today.
Thank you all so much, and good morning, afternoon. I don't know if it's evening anywhere, early morning. I have been trying my best to keep in track with your names and some of the places where you're from, and would just like to thank you all so very much for joining us today. You all do amazing work, and I just consider myself so lucky to be able to work with all of the people who do work in this field. And also just, we know how valuable your time is. We know how many things you're going on. We know for those of us who come from domestic violence services, we know there's always a lot of stuff going on. So we appreciate you taking this time to spend with us today. And I really hope that today is going to open some new thoughts to you. You're going to have some new kind of think about some new things in a different way. Just to maybe what we're going to do is, I've learned just a little bit about all of the places and parts that you are from. Got to give a special shout out to my Ohio crew. So big old OH out there.
I'm a Buckeye right here.
There we go.
So
all right.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing about Ohio is everybody is connected to Ohio in some way, shape, or form. If you ever notice, if you go on vacation and you're in the elevator, you're like, where are you from? And you're like, Ohio. And they're like, oh, my aunt lives in Ohio, or we moved in Ohio in 2nd grade, or my best friend is from Ohio. So just so glad to have you all here. And thank you for the amazing work and the amazing skills that you bring to all of the survivors that you serve every single day. We're actually going to get started with, I hope, just like a little fun poll, just to kind of get to know, not to get to know each other, but just I don't know. It's a webinar, trying to make things a little bit fun. But I'm all thinking about, I had a conversation with my son the other day about what the best superpower was. So I wanted to see if y'all be willing to answer. And the question is, if there was a superpower, if you could have one superpower, what would it be? Your options are be invisible, be able to fly, teleport, time travel, read people's minds, super strength, or other. If there's something else that I missed, there actually is, as I was Googling this the other day, there is a list of top 100 superpowers. So apparently there are a lot of superpowers out here. But I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds to, somebody said be in multiple places at the same time. As a mom of 3 children who are all in different places at all the time, that would make things kind of easy. If I could teleport my kids safely places, that would definitely free up my second shift as a mom Uber in the evening. But let's go ahead, and I'm just going to give you all like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And maybe, Ashley, we can close out that poll and see what people said. Oh, we have quite a teleporting one with 28%, but there's a lot of options. So some people said time travel, 90% said time travel, 90% said read people's minds, 15% be able to fly, be invisible. We have 18 fantastic ideas in the chat. So go ahead and scroll back through the chat to see if you can find some in there. But thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, I know I just saw somebody said in the Midwest, if anybody's out here, we had a 70-degree day yesterday. So everybody thought it's spring, and then it rained all day, and now it was 41 when I woke up. So we always have these little like tricks of weather. So I hope wherever you are, it's sunny or warm, or it will be eventually someday. So I'm going to actually transition over to my PowerPoint. I'm going to get that all pulled up for you.
While you're doing that, I'm just going to real quick. I didn't mention at the beginning, but just to remind everyone, this is a 90-minute webinar. So we will have a little bit less than an hour and a half today or left.
Yep, we will be on whatever time it is in your zone for 80 more minutes. So I'm one of those people who doesn't do well with time zones. But again, I think talking about this whole topic of domestic violence and brain injury, and maybe just giving you a little bit of background where I come from. I work at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, which is the statewide coalition on domestic violence here in Ohio. Many of you have a domestic violence coalition in your state. In some states, they're dual coalitions. A domestic violence and sexual assault coalition are one organization. In some states, they're separate. Like we are here in Ohio, we have 76 local domestic violence programs across the state. 58 of them are programs, domestic violence programs that of course provide a wide variety of services, but do offer residential or shelter services. We also have a handful of culturally specific organizations and non-residential programs. But just to let you know, I am a DV person. I've been with ODVN for 16 years. It'll be 16 years in April. My very first job out of college was in an 103-bed domestic violence shelter. So special shout out to all of you shelter and domestic violence program people on here. Anybody who's worked in the shelter world, I was a second shift advocate. So I worked from 4 to 12. And if you want a quick baptism by fire or initiation into domestic violence services, I would highly recommend the second shift at a big shelter because it's when all the day staff leaves. A lot of times during the day, you know, lots of residents are gone and they're out doing their things. The kids are gone. But then, you know, around 4, 5, 6, 7, everybody starts coming home. There's a couple of us, you know, trying to just keep everything under control. So very, very much, very, very grateful for that experience. I think something that as I've spent the last 16 years at working on a statewide level, and one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this training topic is I came in this area and into this work with incredible intentions. I really cared about the issues, very much been dedicated to issues related to social justice and particularly issues related to violence against women. But I also, in hindsight, could have used a lot more trainings, could have been much more self-aware. And we all, you know, all of our self-awareness grows as we get older, about just the very different life I had lived from many of the domestic violence survivors I was working with, you know, coming in right out of college with, you know, as a 22-year-old, you know, white woman, growing up in a house with a very healthy relationships, trying to again, work with survivors around issues related to parenting and all of that. I think training is something we can never have enough of. We're never done with when we do domestic violence work. We get very, very good at this work, but we don't ever like master it in the same way that you could master something like accounting, for example. And I'm sorry if there are any accountants and maybe you can't master accounting, but you can learn your systems, you can learn your numbers, and you can add things up. You can do grant reports and they're either right or wrong, and you can get to the point where you master that. We always have things to learn. And I think that just, again, my career trajectory, being at the Domestic Violence Coalition and doing extensive work for almost a decade. I did that. I worked in domestic violence for almost 15 years before I ever even thought about brain injury. I think that this is for all of you, wherever you are in your careers. If you had told me 7 years ago today that I'd be here talking to almost 1,000 people about domestic violence and brain injury, my response would have been, one, I don't know what brain injury has to do with domestic violence, and two, y'all are crazy. I'm doing trauma-informed care. That's my piece. I'm still doing trauma-informed care, but I also think one of the things that's our obligation and responsibility in providing domestic violence services, as we know more, we learn more, and we do better. We know better, we do better. And the last 6 or 7 years, which I'll talk a little bit about how we get there, has really turned me into a really passionate advocate for survivors of domestic violence impacted by brain injury. One of the things I often say is I don't know how I did this work for as long as I did without thinking about brain injury and thinking about just the expansive and long-term impact it can have on probably the majority of survivors who I was privileged to be able to work with. But I hope that this is going to really have the opportunity to open your mind and think about some of the things you might have seen, some of the work that you have done through a different lens and in a different way. I just did want to acknowledge, as we're talking today, and very, very much I want you all to think about this, is we are opening a conversation around brain injury and domestic violence here. So in an hour and a half, you are not going to be experts on this. I don't consider myself an expert on this at all. I feel like we've just started to scratch the surface of this area. But really, I want to recognize that strangulation and traumatic brain injury are terrible things. And domestic violence in and of itself, it's a terrible reason to have a job. Most of us who work in domestic violence wish we didn't need to have jobs, which we didn't need to have thousands of shelters around the world, wish an organization or a website like domesticshelters.org didn't have millions of views because there weren't that many people looking for that type of help. But even though we work in this really hard area that we wish didn't exist, strangulation and traumatic brain injury, it's awful. It's awful that this happens to people. It's often that people experience it. It's really hard to talk about. And I also want to recognize that we know that many people who are on this webinar, we know that about 1 out of every 3 and 1 out of every 7, 1 out of every 3 women, 1 out of every 7 men in this country experience intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime. We know many of us get into this field because we have personal connections with domestic violence, being a survivor ourselves, having friends or family that experienced domestic violence, growing up in a home that was not safe, having being impacted by some way. There are survivors who are on this webinar who either are coming on as a survivor or coming on as an advocate working in domestic violence programs. You might have been personally impacted by brain injury and domestic violence and head trauma. And I just want to encourage you. We'll have a few clips of survivors kind of talking a little bit about their experiences. I don't have anything super graphic or don't have any terrible pictures. But I just encourage you, we all have our great self-care skills that we bring to this work and that we need to be able to do. We need to be able to use to work in this really kind of hard, but incredibly rewarding work that we do every day. So if anything is upsetting or disturbing, please feel free to do whatever you need to do to take a walk, take a break. I also will make sure everybody has my contact information and we'll reach out again. You can feel free to reach out to me. What I do know is pretty much across the board, and this has been our experience when talking with survivors and talking with advocates, often we know information is power, knowledge is power, So what we have found, and one of the reasons why I care so much about this work, and I'm so happy all of you are here, is that it can often really help domestic violence victims who have been in experiences, have been in situations where they've been maybe having struggles, they've been having problems. Programs have been, advocates have been struggling to work with survivors. Having this information has been very empowering. The number of domestic violence victims I've talked to who have learned about head trauma and possible head trauma and that impact have found it to be almost a relief to think, oh, I'm not stupid. I'm not crazy. This is real. It's not my fault. It's not something about me. This is a predictable consequence of an injury that somebody else did to me. Really helps people. We know there's so much blame and shame and all of that comes with domestic violence. So
I'm so sorry. I was trying to find a good time to do this. Do you mind unsharing your screen and unchecking that optimized video, because there's a black bar over the closed captionings, so we want to everyone can access.
I am so sorry.
No worries. I was trying to find a good moment because you had some.
I don't know. I didn't. We practiced before and I unchecked it. Checked, got rechecked. So
good. Okay. All better. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. This is what happened. I just wanted to see if Ashley was paying attention. I'm sorry who has closed captioning, because of course it's one of the things about Zoom is what you see is not always what other people say. So we're going to actually launch another poll, if that's okay, Ashley, and just thinking about this question about kind of how knowledgeable do you feel about traumatic brain injury and strangulation, and how to address this with the people you work with. I said our options are absolutely, kind of, sorta, not so much, or not at all. That's why I'm at this webinar. And again, none of this can be traced back to you. I just want to kind of get this. I mean, I know that when I first started this, my answer absolutely would have been not at all, as this wasn't on my radar for a long time. But I'm going to give you all just a couple more. I'm going to count backward from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and see our response, see our results. All right. So 9% of you said absolutely. Great. And I encourage those of you who feel like, oh my gosh, I'm all about this, I can do this. Please feel free to share anything in the chat box that you feel would be helpful. 52% said kind of, sorta, and 28% said not so much, and 11% said not at all. That's why I came. So I really appreciate you all being here and think that we're going to have the opportunity. I'm hoping that this will move us a little bit more closer to kind of whatever is our next step, and will help equip you a little bit more. Though I will say that this is, again, such a big issue. I think one of the things that's has been so common in the domestic violence field is we've talked a lot about trauma and traumatic stress. And I will tell you, before as I said, I've been at ODVN for 16 years, been doing brain injury work for about since end of 2016, early 2017, about 6 years. So I've had a good decade and a half of my career without doing this work. And what I did immediately prior to this grant was led a multi-year statewide initiative around trauma-informed care. And that's a pretty common framework when in domestic violence programs, many of us have thought about and talked about and done lots and lots of training around trauma, and have really recognized that intersection of domestic and sexual violence and trauma. With one of the biggest kind of philosophy shifts of trauma-informed care is really just recognizing the very deep impact that traumatic experiences can have on survivors, how that plays out in their behaviors, how that plays out in their wider lives and their emotions and their relationships. So I lived in that place for many, many, many years. But let me ask another poll question. We're going to pull up real quickly. And I promise we won't have a poll question every 3 minutes. But I wanted to ask, when thinking about this, how often do the domestic violence victims you work with experience violence directed at the head, neck, and face? And if anybody wants to also share in the chat box, how do you know about that? Does it come up? Is it conversations? I mean, I remember when I worked in shelter, I physically saw people who often had, physical signs of head trauma. But your options are very often, sometimes, not that often, hardly ever, or I'm not sure. And I hope that there's no shame in saying I'm not sure. I think it's one of those things. Sometimes if you haven't ever really been thinking about something intentionally, it's very easy to, not ask and not know and not pay attention, which is something that we've heard a lot from survivors and from advocates who are just like, oh, this is not really something I've ever thought about or noticed. So I'm going to give you all 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll see what people said. So, and I think that this is, one of those things that's instrumental. We see that 57% of you said very often, 29% of you said sometimes, 5% of you said not that often, 2% of you said hardly ever, and 7% of you said, I'm not sure. So between just kind of the 2 top answers on this webinar, 86% of people work with people. Over half of people said this happens a lot. And I think that that's something that is, it is not new. I don't think there's anybody who's worked in domestic violence who has thought like, oh my gosh, like head trauma is really, really never happens. And I've never thought about it. And I've never worked with anybody. So I think one of the things that's really interesting, I think, for us to think about is when we know that head trauma is as common as it is, what has happened with kind of making this connection. And it's really interesting. I mean, I remember when I was doing all this trauma-informed care work, traveling all around the state, putting together all of this stuff for our network of programs, and we got this grant on mental health and brain injury, which we're going to be talking about now, about kind of like what we learned. And, it was one of those that I really, even having done, I didn't have to stop and think about for very long, to really think, oh, well, we know there's lots of head trauma. It could make sense that head trauma could cause brain injury, but for the 15 years I've done this work, that was not something that I'd ever really thought about. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pull up, we're going to share another video real quick. It's about 3 minutes long that just goes over kind of what we had the opportunity to get a grant. We partnered closely with Ohio State. The Ohio State University, I'm sorry for those of you from Ohio, and just started talking we partnered with 5 programs. They were a part of our network, and went out and talked to programs at the agency, went out and talked to program staff, went out and talked to survivors. And this is what we learned. Let me make sure I've got the right screen. I have the right boxes checked. So here we go. This video is about 3.5 minutes long.
You hear people talk about evil in someone's eyes, like he looked through me like I wasn't even there. And I remember him putting his hands around my throat and like thinking like, I'm going to die.
When we think about the first picture of a domestic violence victim, the kind of classic iconic image of a battered woman is a woman with a black eye, right? Which one of the things that I realized now in the context of this work is she very well could have had a concussion in the context of that black eye, but it is something that none of us in the field have thought about.
And I don't remember much after that, but a nosy neighbor saved my life. Like somebody had heard all the stuff going on and knocked on the door, and that was the only reason I'm still alive.
And how we hadn't, it's one of those things you say it, you look at the data, we talk about brain injury and hits to the head, and it becomes very obvious very quickly. But even in my role at my organization as a statewide leader, having led a trauma-informed initiative across the state, trained in other states about the work that I was doing, never once had I mentioned brain injury. And how did we manage to miss that?
81% had reported being hit in the head. 50% or so many times that they couldn't remember. And 83% of the survivors working with the organizations reported that they had been choked or strangled so that their brains had been deprived of oxygen.
And the sad part for me is I'm an EMS educator. Like I teach trauma. That's like one of the things I love. And yet, even though as much as I know about trauma, I totally missed the strangulation part, the brain, and the effects that it's had on my body.
Many survivors who have been living with unmet need regarding brain injury intervention for a long time do end up developing comorbid issues like mental health issues and substance use issues, struggles with suicide. So unless we're identifying the underlying brain injury early, there can be other long-term health impacts for survivors of domestic violence who are not receiving the services that they need.
At one point, I attempted suicide. And so it was like, if they would have found this earlier, like, you know, my family has watched, and my friends and family have watched me, you know, try to end my own life and stuff. And it's like, that all could have been avoided had the right people had the right knowledge.
This has just kind of changed how we think about things and how we want to do things. And we're very, very hungry for helping us tackle this, because this really hasn't been tackled in this way before, and helping us from a practice level figure out what this needs to look like in the very complicated, very challenging work that domestic violence agencies do.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening to that. And, you know, please feel free to put any kind of comments in the chat. And there's, you know, a lot there and a lot to think about. You know, and maybe you can think about or reflect or put in the chat if you'd like to, something that stuck out to you about those stories. And it sounded like you all were spot on, you know, and what we did is, I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of how this came to be, is we did interviews, we went to programs, and we did a couple of different things. We had groups where we talked to staff who worked at those programs. Then we also did interviews with survivors who were also accessing those same programs. And this is just an overview of the type of services that survivors were getting, wide variety of domestic violence services. These numbers don't add up exactly just because many people receive multiple different types of services. About 70% of the survivors we're working with were on Medicaid, when really thinking about the important role that health and partnerships and healthcare in the health field really play. This was a little bit about our survivors. I'm actually going to stop real quick. I told Ashley that I do this all the time, and I try to stop and take questions, but then I just get going. So I'm going to stop real quick and see if there's any kind of questions or comments that anybody that we wanted to share or.
I'll keep an eye out, but we don't have any in the document quite yet. So I think that was a good time to continue on.
Okay, perfect. So please, again, feel free to put any of those questions that you have, and we will get to them at some point. But, you know, when we asked, have you ever been hit or hurt in the head? The 49 survivors that we talked to had real in-depth conversations with. You will see this mirrors what you all said. 14% said never, 10% said once, 27% have said a few times, and 49% said too many times to count. That they couldn't even put a number of the amount of head trauma they had. They just didn't even know. When we asked about, have you ever been choked or strangled? We had very, very high rates too. These are the same people who answered this question. So I think that what we're also realizing is people have pretty extensive experiences of blows to the head. People also have pretty extensive experiences of having been choked or strangled where their brain has been deprived of oxygen, that being really bad to the brain, for the brain. And, you know, we see here, like I said, half of them said a few times, 20% said 2 times to remember. So I think it was just this, we were just like I was really just like this. I was like, holy moly, how did I spend 7 years training the whole state on trauma-informed care and didn't mention, like, there's no mention of brain injury in this 130-page trauma-informed toolkit we've put together. Like, how did that happen? And why has this been something, you know, I think we were realizing advocates didn't think about it. And maybe I'm giving away my next question. I'm sorry, I screwed up this poll, but, and I just was wondering, when you think about brain injury, the other thing we did is we talked to advocates about brain injury. And that being a question was, do you think brain injury was on the radar for most of the advocates that we talked to in Ohio? And if you think that, and maybe, I'm sorry, Ashley, did I not give you this poll question?
I have it. No, I just wasn't sure if you wanted to launch it or not. So
Let's not launch it. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Little technical difficulties. That was, yeah. So, and probably many of you would have said no. And that's kind of what we realized. And when we talk to advocates, and these are going to be some direct quotes that people said at our agency. So we realized staff was not recognizing brain injury. So there was one administrator at agency that shared, I mean, I've been here 28 years and we've truly only had a handful of true TBI clients. We had staff saying they didn't know what the impact of brain injury was. There was an advocate that said, we had one client here and she had this traumatic brain injury and had been in a coma for a while. Staff did not understand. They thought she was just being mean, being lazy. Staff shared that they thought victims or survivors might be hiding symptoms. One administrator at a program shared, victims often try to compensate without telling people what's happening with them. Often, try to keep it to themselves or hide it. I encourage you to think about all of the times, and I just remember so many conversations, having conversations with survivors that sometimes I'm working with them, talking to them, they're nodding their head, and I'm like, they're not getting it. And I'm like, do you get it? And they're like, oh yeah, I get it. Really thinking about not, and again, not even really knowing what the words are to put on that. We also learned that survivors had limited knowledge and experience. Staff had limited knowledge and experience. This project that we did had kind of two arms. There was a mental health kind of arm and a brain injury arm. When we asked staff, have you ever had any training? Do you know anything about mental health? There were all these different answers. When we asked staff about, have you ever worked with a survivor who was struggling with their mental health and how did that go? They had all of these stories. Of course, again, not disclosing information, personally identifiable information or any of that, just those general experiences. When we asked about, tell us about an experience that you've had working with a survivor who was impacted by brain injury. This is what we got. We got this silence that people were like, I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way. But what was so interesting, even as a part of the conversations, 20 minutes into the conversation, people would say, oh, remember that survivor, who came in, who had been strangled multiple times and was having this problem. I wonder if that was connected to brain injury. Staff didn't know how to address it. They said, and I think that that's very, very common. And I don't know if you've ever been in that situation in something that if you don't know what, you're not going to open some box if you don't know what to do about it. They didn't know what they were supposed to do. We had a staff member at one of the agencies who said, I've tried to be very careful about letting anybody think I know anything about this because I don't know what those follow-up steps were. Some staff had, and you all, for those of you who work with domestic violence victims, you all might resonate with some of these thoughts or some of these issues. They had mixed feelings about addressing it. If you have come from a framework of kind of trauma-informed approaches and trauma-informed care, one of the biggest things we say in trauma-informed care is do no harm. That's kind of, one of those overarching pieces. We don't want to do things that are harmful. So, we had a domestic violence program director who was like, look, these people are already, in shelter. They're already life is already pretty terrible right now. And it's really hard and all these terrible things that are happening. Now I'm supposed to say you might have a brain injury, but again, we don't know how to address it. We don't know what to do about it. Is that something that's going to cause additional stress and additional anxiety? Is that something that's helpful? We had other staff who were like, well, I'm not a medical professional. I don't have training in this area. Is this something that doctors do? A lot of hesitation around that. And that's something that we really, and to answer those questions quickly, no, doctors are not the only people who can talk about head trauma and head injury and its impact, but we'll talk a little bit about how we learned about how to do that in a way that is trauma-informed and empowering. People didn't know if there are services for brain injury. So one of the things people said is they said, okay, so what if they might have a brain injury? We had people who were in rural Ohio, we don't have any neurologists that we know of. We don't even know what that next follow-up step is. And how helpful is it to bring up something that then we're like, we don't have any, like, we can't like, oh, you might have a brain injury. Sucks to be you. Too bad. We're just going to keep on going along. So really thinking about those need for services. The other thing, they really needed training and resources. They said, we don't have any information about domestic violence and brain injury specifically. For example, in Ohio, one of the things that we know, and we'll talk a little bit about, kind of where most of our knowledge from the brain injury side of things has come through a couple of doors, maybe a couple to a few doors, I guess, but really thinking about, we've talked a lot about brain injury or concussions in sports. We've talked about TBI in the context of military and military service. We know that the most common source of brain injury is really, trips and falls and people slip on the ice and hit their heads, car accidents and things like that. But I mean, even when you think about in Ohio, so, I have kids that play sports, and every time I sign a kid up for sports, there's a concussion fact sheet I get from the Ohio Department of Health that I have to read and sign off on that I got that. The concussion fact sheet about managing a child's head injury from sports is not very helpful for the survivors who work in domestic violence. It's such a different context, and we'll talk about that for a little. So it was a little bit, they really were like, we need training to understand this. We need materials and educational materials, those being so important. Materials for survivors themselves to better understand that are written to understand the trauma, that are written in language that's accessible, that are just kind of take into account this complexity, and a larger framework for how to start talking about this work. So again, we had kind of our work cut out for us when it was, again, this gap, or as some people, I'm starting to call this chasm. Like a gap is like a little thing. Like it was like this, where you see like the cliff on one side and the cliff on the other side, and there's just this big hole in the middle. Is like, we have so much head trauma in our agencies that we're dealing with on a daily basis. And I think that this is one of the things that is so critical for us to understand is we have been working with survivors with brain injuries, for those of us who have been doing this our entire career. We have not known that. And often many of the survivors we're working with have not known that either. So we needed something new. We needed something different. I think we also need to recognize, as we were learning more about DV and brain injury and how that intersects and how it's different from sports and how it's different from military service. And we'll talk about that in a minute. It's in lots of different ways, that this was a different animal. As much as domestic violence and sexual violence, our fields have not talked about brain injury and domestic violence, as much as our fields have not really talked about brain injury, the brain injury field has really not had a strong focus on domestic violence. They've done lots of work, again, with athletes, with the military, with accident prevention and those kind of things. But thinking about domestic violence is just a whole different ballgame. And one of the things that's really, really different, and even when you think about that, when you think about a sports concussion, and one of the reasons why I got that fact sheet from the Ohio Department of Health is because guess what? I go and I watch my kids play lots of sports. So it helps me to be educated on that, because if something happens to my kid or something happens to some other kid, they're on the field, I'm going to be able to recognize some of those signs and kind of what that is and what that happens. I'm going to know a little bit about it as an observer, as a bystander. Now we know that a lot of times sports concussions, and I want to say people can have multiple sports concussions at different points in their sports careers, but it's often kind of a one-time incident, or when people slip and fall, they're not slipping and falling every day and hitting their head in the same way. They're not slipping and falling every week. Really recognizing that when we're talking about the trauma piece of this, the trauma of domestic violence, just even getting a head injury in and of itself is traumatic when somebody intentionally hurts you on purpose. And we know that these are injuries that are happening over and over and over. So people told us, again, I have had this happen to me more times than I can count. And then I'm trying to heal from this head trauma. I'm trying to heal from this concussion. in an ongoing traumatic environment, in a highly stressful environment, which is terrible for your brain. That these are just some considerations that make the approaches we have developed for managing sports concussions and things like that just not all that applicable to domestic violence victims. I'm going to stop again real quick and see if there's any comments, questions, or anything that's come up.
There absolutely have. I think at our last pause prompted a lot of questions to come in immediately. So let's go through some of those. So the first one is, how can doctors determine if and when there has been a brain injury, and is it being screened?
And I think overall, I mean, no, I would not say brain injury screening is routine in any way, shape, or form. One of the things you actually are jumping in, like just talking about understanding brain injury, it's a clinical diagnosis. It is not, there's not a test. When I say a clinical diagnosis, and we'll review this again later, but you get a diagnosis of a concussion, for example. Concussion is another term for a mild traumatic brain injury. Mild traumatic brain injury, concussion mean the same thing. It is, you have some kind of bump, blow, or jolt to the head and some level of altered consciousness. Altered consciousness can be you're dizzy, you're confused, you have some kind of visual disturbances. We'll make sure we have a couple of slides that spell that out a little clearer a little bit later. But if you have A and B, that's a concussion. There's not a test that, it's not like COVID where you take a COVID test and you either have it or you don't. That is what a doctor will make a diagnosis based on, that kind of presence of some kind of head trauma. And then what actually makes it a brain injury is that altered consciousness. And in just a few minutes, we'll talk about some of the different brain functions and how that all connects. So a very good question. I hope a little bit of what's coming will help kind of clarify that a little more.
Maybe let's squeeze one, maybe two more in. The other question would be, how long would it take before the effects of a brain injury show up?
Well, when we talk about the effects of, you all have such good questions. Who wants to stay with me till like tomorrow afternoon? Anybody? I know you all want to. I know you can't. Don't worry. I won't make you make you all do it. But these are really great questions. One of the things to understand, and in just a little bit, we'll get to talking about the brain and understanding how the brain works and brain functions. People can have impacts that show up immediately. People could have impacts that don't show up at all and actually cannot show up for weeks or even months, because the brain is such a complicated organ. And, I really also always say that the brain really has everything to do with everything we do in our world, from our breathing, controlling our heart rate, to these very advanced, to me moving my hands around, to the next thought in my head, to your ability to like listen to this webinar and somebody come in and talk to you and you still be able to listen to that. Our brain is responsible for all of that. So I think that that's one of the brain injury in and of itself is tricky. And I say tricky in a way that depending on what part of your brain is hurt, depending on how it's hurt, depending on the treatment, it can just really change. So for some people, I can notice an impact and a difference right away. For other people, it can be very delayed. And I think one of the other things that makes it even more confusing when we're talking about head trauma is we know that people have also, when people are hit or hurt in the head, when people are choked and strangled, I'm taking you all back to kind of the trauma-informed care work. We think about the psychological trauma that occurs when people are physically assaulted by their partners. So I'm dealing with some of those post-trauma reactions, and my fight, flight, and freeze responses are all up and my brain's all scrambled because I've just been through something traumatic. So we really have both of these things going on inside of their brain. I think one of the other real differences between kind of a sports concussion, when you think about, let's just say a kid who is playing soccer, doing fine, gets a concussion on the sports field, and then is not fine. There's this really obvious difference. It's like, I was good. There's this thing that happened that got identified. And now, they're having headaches. They're having a hard time focusing at school. That was not a problem before then. I think that, and that's again why I'm saying why this is a whole different ballgame, the before and after. A lot of domestic violence victims, things weren't great before they were physically assaulted or hurt in the head or choked or strangled. They're not that obviously that much more worse afterwards, but really thinking about the long-term impact of that. So I wish I had a better answer than you, but it very much is it depends. And it just depends on the person. If any of you have ever had families or friends or known anybody that has had a stroke, People can have strokes and have very, very different kind of levels of impairment. Some people have a stroke and are totally able to walk and move fine. Some people have significant physical incapacities due to stroke. Other people, it's related to language. Again, often can be rehabilitated. So really thinking about the role, the brain is amazing. The brain does grow and change and can relearn to do things, but people don't get better from a stroke and just like magically learn to walk again. There are people who help them with that. So I wish there was a hard and fast answer to that, but I think that that's even one of the more complicated pieces. Is a lot of times after people are assaulted, they're like, well, like I guess I'm kind of okay, particularly, and they might not be okay. But particularly if there is a lack of physical evidence, if there's like, I don't have a big bruise, you know, I was choked or strangled. We know if we're choked and strangled, most of the things that are most dangerous to us are internal that we can't see. It is not abnormal to be, you know, physically assaulted in the head. Lots of survivors have talked to us about, often they have head assaults where their hair is covered or they have things that can get covered up. So, you know, it's kind of like, well, I look okay. And again, I don't know if it's okay. Like I wasn't really okay before I was assaulted. I'm not really that less okay. So I, you know, often cannot make that connection.
Yeah. I want to use just a brief moment of time just to answer questions about what will be covered the rest of the webinar. Because I know one of the questions was, are we going to talk more about like what to do, right? So you're going to
Yeah.
share the care, right? That's the,
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about care. And, you know, Ashley and I have talked about possibly being able to have more opportunities. You're not going to come away with this with like being like, okay, I'm 100% certified. I mean, there's no certification in this, but we will talk about, you know, I think that when we talk about one of the things that we talk about what to do, you know, I think a big part of this is we're going to be talking about and presenting some of the tools that we've developed and that have information for domestic violence survivors and help them learn a little bit more about their brains, about possible brain injury. The other thing that we understand, one of the things we will not be doing unless you are a professional who is trained and it's your role to do this, we will not be diagnosing anybody with a brain injury. We can talk about head trauma. We can talk about the impact of strangulation. But like I said, a traumatic brain injury, a concussion is a medical diagnosis that none of us will be making unless you are a doctor who can make that medical diagnosis. And we'll talk a little bit about our care approach, about kind of how we learned about some effective ways to do that, but might also see about doing another webinar, maybe more in depth about some of that.
Great. Well, I'll leave you to it then.
That really sticks out to me about this, the video that we just heard and we just saw, and if we could have a big group discussion, even though it'd be really hard to have a big group discussion with 997 people. You know, I always like to ask what stuck out to me, but I remember Paula, who was a survivor who was in that webinar, is a good friend of mine. We do a lot of training together. If any of you are going to the NOVA conference, which is the National Association of Victim Assistance Conference, which is at the end of July, beginning of August in New Orleans, Paul and I will be doing a keynote session on this larger topic. But she says in that video, if the right person had the right knowledge, this all could have been avoided. She talked about the impact that had on her suicide attempts. Paula had 11 years between her near fatal strangulation and her diagnosis and the identification of her brain injury. And in that 11-year period, you know, it's a horrible, like, lost decade of her life. She was, you know, diagnosed with 14 different medical and mental health conditions, was at one point on 22 different medications, was told by doctors and professional, you know, that she would not be able to drive. She would have to get on disability. And again, it was, she had all of these health problems, but it was really like this lack of recognition, even though, you know, she actually is, Paula's a paramedic, and she talks about that. She was treated in the emergency room that she worked in. So her strangulation was documented in her medical file, but it was never taken into consideration. Somebody asked about, you know, the short-term versus the longer-term impacts. really, really thinking about that, the connections were not made, even though it was all there. But I think that this is what I think I think part of this webinar is going to hopefully help you all think of yourselves as the right people. And again, I don't think our role is, like I said, we are not going to be diagnosing brain injury. We are not going to be, we're going to be thinking about how to approach that in a trauma-informed way. But we're starting to put this on the table for ourselves, for those of us who work with survivors, and also for survivors, and just really sharing some more information. I have had, I think one of the things that has been so stark for me with survivors who have reached out to me from across the country, probably because they were Googling things. Maybe they saw an article on domesticshelters.org. Who knows where that came from? They came to a webinar, somebody told them about this. How many of them have been out of abusive relationships for years and years, and are still having pretty significant health problems, still having pretty significant problems, just like with issues of something that actually comes from the occupational therapist framework, but they call it activities of everyday living. Just the things that we need to do our daily lives every day. And again, nobody would think that, 8 years later, Paula's problems with her, dizziness and her vertigo and all of that and her balance programs could be connected to something that happened 8 years ago. I've worked with survivors who have, done some of the emotional healing. We know trauma and domestic violence does change you, but, these are often survivors. They're in new relationships. They're in a better place in their lives, but they're still having significant problems living their lives. So I think that that's why this education and information done in a way that is trauma informed it's just a game changer for survivors. It's a game changer for programs, and it's a game changer for survivors. And the number of survivors who have been like, oh my gosh, I'm not just stupid. I thought I was stupid. I thought maybe this stuff wasn't real. I thought I was crazy. Being able, and don't those sound like things that their partners tell them, right? They hear that all the time. You're not going to be okay if you leave me. You're lucky that I had you. You know what I mean? Like all of this, and then they're in relationships, whether they've been able to escape or not, and they're having a hard time doing things that they used to do. I think that this really changes all of our perspectives. So what I'm advocating for, and I don't know if you remember at the beginning, we had this deviant trauma, like these two kind of overlapping circles. I think particularly when we talk about those of you who are providing services for domestic violence victims, a DV shelter, like people are getting a service for domestic violence, a court order, coming to, approaching an organization that helps domestic violence victims. I think brain injury is a significant plays a significant role in survivors' lives. We do not have good population-based data. We have never asked these questions. So like I said, the smaller samples we're doing of smaller, research we do within DV programming and things like that is showing incredibly high rates of head trauma. But just like you think about all of the work and all the information, all of the training and all we have done around all of the frameworks we have developed in the, around trauma, I think that brain injury plays, I think that one of the reasons why this is the kind of next step of trauma-informed care and really figuring out what trauma and brain injury-informed care looks like. And it really is bringing that neurological framework to things. We have had a very psychological framework from domestic violence. And, you think, even when you talk about, again, very first image of domestic violence as head trauma. What were some of the original things we called that? We called that battered woman syndrome. We called that learned helplessness. We haven't talked about those things in football players who have been hit in the head over and over. We just really need to think about what is the neurological role of what domestic violence does to people, along with the psychological framework. It's not either or, but really, really thinking about understanding some of the things that we're asking people to do as brain capacities, really thinking about brain functions. That's what we're going to be moving into talking about. I think that really changes our services. And I think it's this framework on, people, and often I think that one of the things that we realized when we did our original research, we have, a section of people who get our domestic violence services or whatever types of services that are helpful, that work well, that things go well, that they get what they need. But we also have this slice of people that just have a really hard time. And I think when we think about this framework, is somebody not working on their case plan because they won't? They could, if they cared enough, if they prioritized it enough, if they were invested in it, or is it because they can't? Maybe they can't maybe their brain has been hurt in a way that makes it really, really difficult for them to do their services, to do our services in the way we are designed, which of course we have not designed services at all, taking brain injury into account at all. But when you think about, and I don't know if this is the best analogy, but it's very, very different when my 10-year-old can tie their shoes, but won't, because they're being a little, all of you have had that child, for those of you who had that child, we have that moment when you're like, they can do something, but they just won't. Versus, my 3-year-old who can't tie their shoes. It takes us to a very different place. We have to be very careful about not taking us to a place that's too paternalistic, but it makes us think differently about the survivors that we work with, and think differently about our role, and think differently about our services. And it really being on us as domestic violence professionals to create services that are helpful, and that are accessible, and that survivors can access. It's not a survivor's job to fill out all the forms the way we need to have them done. It's our job to make forms that survivors can fill out. So I think when you see some of these descriptors of survivors who are confused or unmotivated or disorganized, or they need to get it together, or they're just not paying attention to anything, or they're demanding, or they don't care, they don't want it enough. I've worked with advocates like, I shouldn't have to work harder than survivors work. I think we need to examine ourselves. Remember, I was talking about self-reflection and self-awareness being really important. I'm kind of like getting paid to work. So I think that a part of it is like, just really like, it's my job to help survivors. So survivors need help. It's my job to do that. But also really thinking about like, they just need to want it more. People who don't learn from past errors. So I make the same mistakes again and again. And people who are non-compliant, who aren't doing things the way we want them to, the way we think we should. With all of these people, I think one of the very first things that I would, as a helper, and I would help survivors also think about that, is thinking about what role could head trauma be playing in this. I even remember working with survivors who, again, maybe did something super impulsive. I worked with a survivor I remember once who we had this plan, and she was saving up, her checks to be able to get her rent, and got her check and went out and bought steak for everybody in the shelter. And many of you had those moments where you're like, what were you thinking? Like, come on. And even she was like, I don't know why I did that. Well, guess what? Like that whole controlling impulses, that whole thinking through things, that's a brain function. That should have been a sign right there that this is one of the things that we need to talk about. And this is one of the things that I need to include into thinking about, how do I support a survivor, and how do we talk to a survivor? Quickly, Ashley, or
Yeah, they are coming in just as fast as you're sharing information.
I
So
know we're gonna have a Q&A session. That's what I was thinking about. Just questions and answers.
We'll definitely set a date for that. Let me just pick out one or two here that I think are probably on everyone's mind. So if a victim has experienced a traumatic brain injury, what medical or mental health resources can domestic violence advocates refer or direct them to?
Well, and again, I wish I had an easy answer to this for you, because one of the challenges that we have, and I think that this is also how we're thinking about our advocacy, is the mental health field does not know a lot about brain injury, has not really had much training on what this is. Neither has the medical field. So I think a lot of this really thinks about, when we think about this, I don't know if any of you have been doing this work long enough to remember when there were parents and mothers of this movement that built some of the systems that exist in that work right now. I think that one of the things we'll talk a little bit about with some of our care tools is how are we helping them get to, I think one of the first steps and one of the most realistic steps is getting them to a primary care doctor. And is there a way we can help provide some information. I don't know if any of you, one of the things we're really looking at in Ohio is mobile advocacy. If we're able to go to appointments with survivors, medical appointments and things like that, but also maybe potentially working with survivors to write down and have some information, provide some information that they can take with them to their medical provider, that talks about their history of brain injury, that talks about their history of head trauma, that talks about some of the things that we're struggling with. One of the things when we talk about communicating is it can be very, very hard, and getting medical care is something that is really can be very anxiety provoking. A lot of survivors we work with have had really bad experience getting medical care. So I think it is really, how are we supporting, how are we also developing relationships in local communities with medical professionals to start to get them some kind of information and some kind of training around this. I know we're working on some telehealth options here in Ohio that are not nearly ready, but I think that we're going to have to be creative about some of the ways that we're doing training, some of the ways we're partnering with medical professionals in our communities, some of the ways that we're partnering with mental health professionals and starting to introduce this whole layer of brain injury. I think one of the things that's very true is when we talk about it, it's a complicated, complex mix. When we talk about mental health and brain injury, we know that many physical health problems, there are also survivors who have many unmet physical health needs. So, I wish I could say, oh, well, here's this doctor that everybody can call that can just kind of figure this out. It's going to be complicated and complex, but this is really when thinking about systems advocacy and how we need to be building bridges to address domestic violence and its multiple health consequences, including brain injury.
Yeah. And I recall you have kind of a document that will make sure that we link to that, like you mentioned, like an actual sheet that someone that thinks they have a traumatic brain injury can bring to the doctor's office and share in person. I think that's
and I wish I could guarantee that all doctors would take that seriously.
Right.
And some we have had some of our tools that have been very, very well received by hospitals, by medical professionals. I think one of the things that we have to assume is probably when we're talking about brain injury, and we're providing referrals or connecting people with mental health or physical health services, that brain injury is not going to be considered unless it gets brought up. I mean, like I said, how many of us have done domestic violence work for freaking, like I taught the whole state about trauma-informed care until 6 years ago without ever talking about brain injury. You know what I mean? So, I think that, but I think it is also cultivating those relationships with providers who maybe are open to that information, do want more training on this, do want to kind of figure this stuff out. So, I think that if we have, for any of you who do have programs that provide, again, mobile advocacy or health advocacy services, and we can have people going to doctors and going to appointments with survivors or supporting survivors around that, I think that there's a tremendous opportunity to do some of that advocacy.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I'll let you continue on. I think, what most people are kind of asking for is that, like, how can we help? What can we do?
Okay.
Piece. And then, but I love that you've offered to do some Q&A later on. So we'll have some details on that.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to spend just a few minutes talking about the brain. And then we will spend some time talking about, talk a little bit about our model, about some of the tools that we've developed and some of the hands-on things that we can do. But I think, when talking about kind of how our brain works, it really is, our brain, our life consists of all of these different things, with things we want or like to do, the things that we have fun with, the things we enjoy, things we need to do that we might not enjoy or not want to do, and other things that we're expected to do. And the reality is that our amazing brain makes all of this possible. And we're going to spend, like I said, just a few minutes, and then I'll kind of jump over to talking about care. Our amazing brain makes all of this possible. So I'm just going to spend just a minute so we understand when we're saying, again, we talk a little about concussions or traumatic brain injuries. The way that happens when there's some kind of bump, blow, or jolt to the head, to this brain. And then it alters our brain function. So I'm going to take you back to high school science for just a minute. That brain cells are neurons which connect to each other to form efficient pathways. And this is how, when we learn to talk, we learn to walk. We think about our brain is amazing. And I think that that's one of the things that we never want to forget. Our brain is always and constantly changing and growing, can heal, can learn to do new things. But again, sometimes we need specialized support, rehabilitation services, those kind of things. So you want to think about a healthy brain as like a city with 0 traffic jams. So I am here talking to you all, thinking about something else. I'm moving my hands. I'm able to do all these different things at the same time all at the same time. But we know that the brain needs nutrients and protection. And this is where strangulation and kind of traumatic brain injury or concussions come in. So we know that the brain weighs about 2% of our body weight, uses about 20% of our oxygen. Very, 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 very dependent on oxygen. Oxygen is the fuel that makes our brain work. And we know we get oxygen by a couple of sources. We get oxygen by breathing. Obviously, we also have blood vessels that bring oxygen and nutrients to the brain. So we have blood that pumps through our heart, gets oxygenated, goes back up to our brain, deposits oxygen, comes back, pumps through our heart, brings that back up to the brain. As you can see, when just even thinking about that, and that's something that I think a lot of people, we've done a lot of talk about strangulation in our field, I think more so probably than traumatic brain injury, but really thinking about strangulation as a cause of brain injury and as a cause of potentially long-term problems. It's because when our brain doesn't get oxygen, what does it do? It kills those brain cells. And we can see how important that is and how much that matters when we talk about people who have strokes, for example. That's another example of what's called an anoxic hypoxic injury, which is when our brain is deprived of oxygen. So we have that piece. We also know that our brain, we want to think about it like a gelatin-like material. It's protected by fluid. It's kind of, like I said, jello packed very tightly in our head, which keeps our brain safe by the skull tissues and fluid. So that's actually what happens when people have a traumatic brain injury, when people are maybe assaulted in the head, hit in the head, fall and hit their head, thrown onto the ground. What happens is our brain actually jolts around in our head and can hit up against our skull. So we know, particularly when we talk, and we'll talk about the parts of the brain in just a minute, but our frontal lobe right here, which is a part of our brain right here, we know that the inside of our skull and the front right behind our forehead is pretty jagged and pretty rough. So often we see if our brain kind of jolts against that, that can cause, and again, it damages the tissue and damages the brain. We know that if something that happens with our body is if we get an injury, it can swell. And that's fine if it's an ankle, less good if it's our brain. So I'm actually going to do this, and then we're going to talk for just a few minutes about care, and can maybe again do a longer webinar in the future to kind of about care and implementing care. But I think, again, this is somebody asked, earlier about, what are impacts? What does this look like? We see all these different parts of our brain are responsible for different things. So we have the back, our occipital lobe, sight. When we talk about sight, we are not able to, if we have some kind of alteration in sight, people who see stars, people who are dizzy, people who aren't seeing things correctly, people who have problems with their vision, that is really one of those hallmark signs of potential brain injury. We have different parts of our brain that coordinate balance and heart rate and swallowing. The temporal lobe, which does language, hearing, and comprehension. Our long-term memory is stored in a very different part of our brain than our short-term memory. You will see that all of these brain functions, kind of have different roles. We have the parietal lobe, which helps us integrate information from our senses. So we hear something, we see something, we feel something, we know what it is. Coordinates movement. We have this really, really important part of our brain right here called a frontal lobe, which is where our executive functions are housed. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But that plays a role. I think one of the things that I really want you all to take away from today, which is hopefully going to be, again, one of the first times you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about this in your future, is that a lot of things that you might just assume people can do or should be able to do, or are having problems that they shouldn't have doing in your services, are actually brain functions. So remembering things, our short-term memory is a brain function. Our ability to control ourselves, to control our emotions, is our brain function. When we're making judgment calls, when we're, trying to decide what to do, that's a brain function. And what's so unique about this frontal lobe, and a couple of very important jobs it does, is it transfers information into memory. So like, for example, for those of you who jumped on the Zoom, you might not have been on a Zoom for a while, but you knew what to do. You might have not done it, but you had done Zoom before and you were able to remember it. You can bring it back up. You know how to unmute yourself. You know how to get on. It also helps us put the brakes on those impulses, which helps us either do something now that's hard, but it's better for us in the long run, or not do something that we really want to do because it's better for us in the long run. Thinking about that example of that survivor I had who went out and brought steak for everyone. Thinking about if any of you were ever in school and remember, and you had a test the next day and your friends called you and they wanted to go out, you being able to say, oh, I really want to go out, but I am not going to go out because I need to get a good night's sleep. I need to study for my test. And tomorrow I'll be really, really glad I did it. That is a brain function. People talk about things with survivors. Survivors aren't motivated. They need to be more motivated. Motivation is a brain function. Being able to get started, being able to do the next task, being able to get started on things. Those are what our executive functions are. So right here, these are all of those brain functions right here, which include all of these things. Again, for us in our programs were things that we just took for granted that people can do, that talked about prioritizing and problem solving and time management, even starting things. When I have to go find a job, what's the immediate first thing you do when you go find a job? You don't, like, a job just doesn't fall into your lap. There's all of these tasks, figuring out what the first thing to do is, organizing and planning, multitasking, being able to do multiple things at the same time, managing emotions and controlling impulses, that social and sexual behavior as far as and even self-awareness. Those are all brain functions. And again, for most of, if you looked at this list, you were like, yeah, people kind of need to be able to do most of the stuff well to be able to get our services, or to be able to do well in our services, or be able to escape an abusive relationship, or be able to get a protection order, all of those kind of things. So when the brain is healthy, this all works. It works like smooth, like, again, this lack of traffic jam. But when the brain gets hurt, guess what happens? What we know is that the frontal lobe is the most likely part of our brain to be impacted by head trauma. And we talked about that this part is again, the most sensitive part to head trauma, particularly sensitive to the lack of oxygen. So when our brain doesn't have oxygen, this part of our brain needs the most oxygen. So guess what? All of this becomes really hard. All of this becomes really hard. And when we think about that, and this is, again, it makes it so people can't access our services. It makes it so and if you think about the clients that we get frustrated with, the people who often end up not being able to get our services and end up being unsafe again. So when we talk about executive dysfunction, it's really when we can't manage our thoughts, emotions, and actions, which again are a brain function. And we know there's this very complicated combination of brain injury, of trauma, of mental health and addiction that all impact that. But if you look at this, just some examples of executive dysfunction include things like focusing just too much on one thing, being easily distractible, daydreaming. This is, again, is written for a little bit of a different, this is, I think that this handout is not necessarily meant for domestic violence shelters, but struggling to switch between tasks, trying to do one thing, then the other thing, then come back to that thing. That's a brain function. That problems with impulse control, trouble starting difficult or boring tasks. And all of us have had a moment of that in our life where there's something really hard. What we need to do, we need to get started. We don't want to get started. We're cleaning our office because we have this grant application that we need to work with. But this is what we're working with in shelter. So one of the things that we've really thought about and we learned about, I'm actually going to take a minute and kind of switch over to some of our care information, and hopefully, actually I'm going to do one more. I'm going to talk real quickly about some of the signs and symptoms, and then we'll talk a little bit about care, and kind of open your eyes when we think about understanding that brain injury can impact us emotionally, can impact us physically, can impact our cognitive functioning. So some of these things, like survivors struggling with becoming easily frustrated, aggressive or inappropriate behavior, all of these different things, that they're non-compliant, they say or do things without thinking, they don't get along with others, they not follow directions. Some of the cognitive things, and so those thought processes, which are so important to our domestic violence survivors, that we have to make plans. It's called safety planning, for crying out loud. We have to be able to think through things and think about a safety plan. You put this here, you do this here, you make sure this, you check on your kids, you do all of that. I think we've really kind of honestly taken for granted, or just not thought about the cognitive abilities that people need to be able to get our services. Another issue with physical health symptoms, if people are sensitive to light and sound, they're having vision problems. Survivors who I used to work with who are wearing sunglasses inside, maybe they were sensitive to light. That's, again, when we thought that's a potential sign of brain injury. People have problems with balance. They're tripping all over the place. Fatigue, really thinking about that. Those are some of those things that, again, I think we have all never paid attention to. And if you have a problem with your vestibular system, which is a system that, again, controls your balance in your body and your space and time, you can go to the best therapist in the world and they're not going to be able to help with that. So, I think what this really has started to really make us think, and as we had this challenge from our domestic violence programs about what do we do about this? What does this look like? How do we need to do this? And I'm going to come to really talking about, we're going to spend the last few minutes talking about CARE, which is a framework. I think one of the things that if those of us who work in domestic violence knows that we do person-centered work, we do individual work, we have to work differently with different people in different ways. And this really, really fits into the trauma-informed framework, which again, that framework that thinks about things as not what's wrong with you, but what happens to you, and really recognizes that trauma impacts the survivors that we work with. So we have to do things differently. We're taking a page from that playbook and thinking about that in the context of brain injury. So, and I want you to think about some of what we talk about CARE as a toolbox. It is not like I'm not giving you a hammer because you always need a hammer. You don't always need a hammer. Sometimes you need a hammer. Sometimes you need a saw. Sometimes you need a tape measure. Sometimes you need a leveler. Sometimes you don't even need tools. You need something else. So it really is not about, I think that I wish that there was a prescriptive way in which I could say, oh, ask these 2 questions to everybody, send everybody to this doctor, have this test, and then everybody's good. That's not what this issue is. And that's not what this issue will ever be. But CARE is really based in connecting with survivors by forming those genuine and healthy relationships. This is a relationship-based framework. If we do not have the connection, we are not going to be able to either identify some of those signs and symptoms we talked about. We're not going to be able to talk to survivors about that. We know that survivors often don't have a context themselves for these kind of things. So that connection and that relationship building piece is so important. The A is talking about acknowledging that head trauma and mental health challenges are common. So we as providers, as professionals who work in this, are going to come into this with a framework, knowing that it's kind of our job to think about head trauma. It's our job to provide information and education to survivors, of which I'll talk about in just a minute, to provide some of that information, to talk with survivors, to have conversations and identify how are you being impacted individually? What are you seeing as, what are those, I don't want to say barriers, like what are those things that are getting away with you living your life you want to? Is it your memory? Is it your ability to control your emotion? Is it you're too tired to do anything? Is it you just get overwhelmed and don't know what to do? Is it I get lost anytime I go everywhere? Brain function. What is that? Let's work together to identify that. And then this is a framework that's based on service provision through accommodations. And accommodations are just basically providing services in a way that meets somebody's individualized needs. I might have a slide that says that in just a minute, but it really is around if somebody is having problems with their memory, we need to work with them about how do we help them remember things in different ways? How do we use things like reminders on phones? How do we as advocates help them remember what they need to do? If they're having problems with intention and focusing, can we do case management meetings in a shorter way? Can we have case management meeting in places that are less distractible? If people are identifying sleep problems that they can't sleep, how are we supporting people with sleeping? Can we, and of course, this is never perfect. Domestic violence doesn't exist in a perfect world. None of us have ever worked at agencies that have perfect situations, but can we provide eye masks? Can we provide earplugs? Can we have an area of our shelter that maybe tries to be a little quieter? Does somebody need woken up from naps? How do we talk with survivors about how to help them sleep the best? And then we really need to think about our community collaborations and building those effective, accessible referrals and advocacy for individuals who need additional care. Who else are we needing to connect them in the medical community, in the mental health community? Who else are we? Many of us might have brain injury organizations who work in their space. We have a very close collaboration with the Brain Injury Association of Ohio. And then that's what our response is. We're really thinking about these accommodations and these, again, effective, well-researched referrals, but we're also not doing referrals in the way, here's the phone number, good luck. And then next week, you haven't followed up in the referral. What's wrong with you? Don't you care about this enough? Again, thinking about what extra support people might need. Then we're evaluating those accommodations. We're evaluating those accommodations and referrals and checking in with survivors and seeing if they're helpful, if they're not helpful, if they're working, if they're not working. One of the things I would encourage anybody who works with domestic violence victims to just understand, this is a part of service provision. We don't always get things right. And I'm not saying that any kind of bad way. There's a lot of trial and error with working with domestic violence victims. There's lots of things that work, then a situation change, then something changes, something's different. And then we need to go back to the drawing board and think about something else. That's how we do safety planning. That's how we do case planning. It is and a referral to somebody who they can't get in contact with, who they don't feel supported with, who they don't know how to get there isn't very helpful. So part of this is going to be this feedback loop we have with survivors. And I think this is something else with self-awareness. We all need to evaluate with ourselves. If things aren't working for survivors, that doesn't mean that we're bad at our jobs. That just means we need to come up with something else. We're going to have to try something else, and it's going to need to be different. We need to touch back regularly and see if are our case management meetings feeling more helpful. I know we've been taking notes on things to help you remember. How's that working? And we have to do that. That's why we have to form this connection in a way that people can say, no, it's not really working for me. And if it isn't working for you, guess what the response is? Okay, well, let's try something else. That's not on you. That's not on me, but let's continue to try something else. And so we have the care tools that we have developed as a part of this project, some educational tools and some tools for survivors that are available on ODVN.org. In just a minute, I will go to the website and show you where those are. But it really is thinking about how are we using our care toolbox to do this kind of stuff. One of the things that we do know, I'm going to go to the slide and then go back over to our website, and then maybe we'll have time for another couple of questions. But if people don't have questions, answers, we're going to figure out a Q&A at some point. And also you can contact me individually. But CARE has been evaluated by The Ohio State University and really has been shown to improve overall agency trauma-informed practices. We do have a couple of journal articles out about CARE and the CARE tools that anybody can email me and I can send to you. I'm not allowed to put it on the website or anything because of copyright issues, but it really helps advocates. It improves our overall agency trauma-informed practices, as well as the ability to address specific health issues such as strangulation, traumatic brain injury, mental health, substance use, and suicide. Helps us think about that because it really helps staff feel empowered to address head trauma and strangulation. And then we're providing those accommodations and functional supports. I'm going to take you all very quickly to our website. Give me 1 second and show you where these care tools are. They are free. Most of them are translated into Spanish. But I'm just going to show you. I like to think our website makes tons of sense and everybody can find everything. But, we're a nonprofit just like everyone else. So if you go to odvn.org right here and you see our work and you click on brain injury, this is our webpage on the Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury. You will see that short video that I played earlier. There's also a recording to a longer national radio show talking about this issue. But down here, you see we have CARE brain injury materials. We have some educational materials here, and I'll just give you one example. We have a head injury education card that is just a front and back and says, has your head been hurt? It's got some information about any of the things that can cause head injuries, what some of the physical problems are, what some of the thinking or cognitive problems are. Here's some guidance about what to do after you have a head injury. See a doctor and tell them. What we know is that it's always good to see a doctor after a head injury. It's not always realistic. It's not always something that survivors want to do, but really helping them know that these are some of the danger signs and red flags. So if you have some of these things going on, you really might want to consider getting medical attention. And if a survivor wants medical attention and they're having problems getting it, we need to help facilitate that. We have a piece on if you're choked or strangled. We don't have any separate strangulation brochures from TBI. Like here's the TBI brochure, here's the strangulation brochure. They're all integrated because most domestic violence survivors have had trauma and strangulation. Those are things that cannot be separated out. But we have had, for example, remember, care is your toolbox. We have had agencies that have used these cards and had survivors circle the things that was going on to them and taken it to their medical provider. And we actually had one hospital who called one of our local programs and said that was really helpful. They said, I'm having this, I'm having this, I'm having that. I'm going to show you another couple. There's a longer, I'll show you this real quick. There's a long, this is called Invisible Injuries. It's a longer almost workbook that has information about what happens when your head gets hurt, what causes a head injury, what happens right after your head was hurt. We have a log for people to keep track of head injury symptoms. What are some of those symptoms? I think what can often happen when people have been hit or hurt in the head. We need to know if they're getting better or if symptoms are improving or not. And I don't know if you've ever had that where sometimes you feel like you get a little bit better each day, but you don't feel like you're getting better at all until you look back and see. So if I'm having a headache 24 hours a day, and then 2 weeks later, I'm having a headache 8 hours a day, I'm doing better. So this can help people log symptoms. This is something, if you're not getting better, this is a page that people could take to a provider. Consider sharing this log with your doctor and tell them that you've been hurt in your head. We have information about strangulation. We have safety planning information. So that's in there. And please feel free again to look at all of these. We have over here some partner inflicted brain injury promising practices that just really is a short guide to talk through, and some agency promising practices. We have, I'm going to talk about these last two resources. We have a chats tool, which is right here, some actually yes or no direct questions you can consider using or consider asking. Sometimes having a formalized tool like this and doing a formalized almost a screening or assessment makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. So I would encourage you to think about, again, it's less about memorizing these questions and asking them exactly how they are. It's about building that relationship and opening up those conversations and being able to ask about anything that had been happened to domestic violence survivors that has made it hard to breathe, something that made it hard to breathe, or if they've ever been hit or hurt in the head, neck, or face. The other thing that we have here, there's a guide for how to use this. You will see on the back of this. There's also, this is another tool that could potentially be taken to a doctor or a mental health professional, addiction specialist professional, where people can fill out some of this information, because people often, if they're having head trauma, might not remember to mention all of these things. There's an advocate guide for how to use that. And what to do that hopefully is pretty self-explanatory. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is our accommodations checklist about some of the accommodations we were talking for, some of the things that we can do. For example, if someone's having physical health challenges, we can ask if there has been anything helpful that they have done in the past to manage these symptoms. We can help identify if there are any activities that bring on or worsen problems. We have challenges related to sensory problems, light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, sleep difficulties, and fatigue. We have issues related. I'm going to just jump real quick to some thinking problems. How do we help people get when they're having problems getting things started or figuring out what to do next? Understanding things. Those are some tools for you. So it has officially been 80 minutes since I told you to remember that. I want to share my contact information for you. I'm hoping that we will be able to continue this conversation. This is something that I do believe, like I said, when you think about, y'all didn't learn about trauma-informed care in one webinar and know how to do that perfectly. We're going to need to do lots of work on this. And I really appreciate your time and interest today for coming in to do this. Thank you to domesticshelters.org for having me. Please feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions. And please take this information and do what you need to do with the care framework. That's really what it's meant for. So thanks so much. I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll be here. I don't know if we'll be here and be happy if I don't. You let me know, Ashley, if we need
Well,
to.
yes. So let's talk for next steps. So what we'll do is Rachel and I will chat about a date to do a follow-up. So we've collected all of your questions. We'll send out a registration and with a opportunity to ask more questions. I do think there's just so much information to cover, and so we want to give give it enough time to really dive in and answer everyone's questions. So keep an eye out for an upcoming webinar Q&A session with Rachel, and we'll send some more details about that. And just some reminders, we have recorded this session, so we will put that up on our website within 1 week. Everyone that's logged in right now is on our email list to receive that information. If you're calling in, I do see a lot of phone numbers on our attendees list. Don't forget to send us a quick note to info@domesticshelters.org, just with your email address. Everyone who is logged in on Zoom on their computer or phone, we do have that information already, so no need to send us an email. But with that, we will wrap up today. This portion of the session, Rachel, we do have our sponsor Cap 60 is going to stick around to do a demo, so you're welcome to hop off.
Perfect.
But thank you so much for being here today, Rachel. This has been really.
Everyone check out Cap 60. It looks very interesting. So feel free to do that. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Rachel. All right, well, we'll go ahead and welcome Sean right now. Thank you so much for being with us again. We're so glad to have you.
Hi, thank you. That was a really great, Rachel. That was a lot of information there. It was really great. So thank you for that. All right, so for everyone who is going to stick around, what I'm going to do is I want to show a demonstration of our client management software. Essentially what this is, it's a software that lets you, track clients, services, and ultimately help on reporting to maintain that funding or even get more funding in a perfect world. So I'd like to show you a bit about how our system works, so you get an idea, and then of course invite you to come see a full demonstration. And for any agency that does participate in a full demonstration, we will also send you a virtual Starbucks gift card, kind of copy on us. It's just as a little thank you for coming in there. All right, so I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully you guys are able to see this. You should see a blue and white screen. It says welcome demo staff.
Yes, looks great.
Awesome, great. So again, this is a data management system. We capture information for your reporting and stuff. Now, please do feel free to ask questions. I will try to keep an eye on the chat and stuff, or on the Q&A. So please do feel free to ask some questions if you have any. But I'm going to show you kind of the beginnings, the basics of how things work here. So what you're looking at is this is what it looks like when you log into Cap 60. So across the top, you'll see there's got this blue bar, and there's different little links you can click on, and we call these modules. Each module governs a different area of the system. And when you go into a module, when you click on one, underneath it on the white bar, you're going to see we break it into smaller sections just to make it easier to navigate. And when you click on one of the sections, on the left are the pages that are available. So that's how the basics work. It's very easy to navigate around. Now, we do have user group and authorization settings. And what this does is allow you to set which modules, which sections, and which pages your staff have access to. And a lot of agencies do these based on job description. Like an intake worker might access the intake area, the caseworker or advocates access the client management areas, stuff like that. But again, they're up to you. You can set them up however you want. And the really great part about this is once you've set those up, when someone logs into Cap 60, they only see what they have access to. So everything is part of their job. They're not going to go anywhere they're not supposed to go, and they're not going to have anything extra that they don't need. So it makes it very easy for them to get around and do things that they want to do. And Brittany is asking for a Cap 60 link. I will be happy to give you the link to our website. You can check us out. And there's even a page on there where you can request a demo also. So I can give you just a quick link to the website. And then there's also information, I believe Ashley's going to be sharing some information too at the end of the demo that has this information on there as well. But I put it in chat in case you guys want that. Oh, and there it is from Ashley as well. All right. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through an intake, show you how we enter a client into the system, and then we'll talk about some of the different things you can do and some of the different reports you can run. So you notice I'm in the client module, went to the intake section, and we have our victim services, which is the intake page. This is where we add clients in. Now we do also have a hotline intake form designed for, like, if your agency has hotline or crisis line. It's a very quick one-page form that lets you get the basics you need, track the information you need to, but still spend most of your time working with your clients. And we do have a human trafficking form as well. So if your agency helps with helps preventing human, I don't want to say helps with human trafficking, helps prevent human trafficking or helps the survivors, we do have a specific intake form for that as well that captures the information you need from there. But today I'm going to use the normal victim services intake form. So we come in here and I'm just going to fill out some of the fields. You'll see that there are fields with red stars. A red star means that that field is required to enter someone in. Now, when we get to name, you can enter the client in anonymously. You see you have this anonymous. If you say yes, it'll let you enter the client anonymously. Right? So a name is not necessarily required if you want to enter them in anonymously. But I'm going to put a name in today. Right? Sex, we have male, female, and other. If you choose other, there is a gender identification drop down, and that is customizable. So you can make sure the terms that you need to report on or that you want to track are in there. So that is a customizable gender identification drop down as well. For birth date, a lot of times, sometimes clients will give you their birth date information. Sometimes they don't want to give that information out, which is fine. Maybe they give you their age. They say, oh, I'm 23 years old. Well, you can put in a fake birthday, mark it as a fake birthday. So that way for your demographic reports, you'll have they'll have the age for demographics, but you're going to know that this is not their actual birth date. And if they don't want to give any of that information, you can also mark age not tracked. And then on your reporting, it will say that you were not able to obtain that information. So you can actually track all of that as well. And at the bottom, you can enter in contact information and whether or not it's safe to use that information. Now, once we have this first page filled out, when we click the next button, the system is actually going to search and see if this client already exists in the system. If they're already in the system, you don't have to redo the intake. You can just go right in and start working with them in their client management area, giving them new services, putting them in shelters, whatever you might need to do or want to do in there. Sarah's asking, is there a space to record interventions applied? Yes, there's different ways to track different things. If you want to track that as a service, that can be definitely put in as a service. You can track it through notes, counseling. We have a counseling area. If you want to count that as a counseling session, we can do that. So really just depends on how you want to track and report on it as to where you might want to track it in the system. But yes, we can definitely track those kinds of attempts as well. All right, so I'm going to click my next. Now, if it does not find a match, it takes you into the intake, the rest of the intake process. It starts with a safety assessment. Now, this is an optional assessment. We did develop it with our victim service agency. So all these questions are questions that came directly from victim service agencies. But again, this is optional. If you don't want to do it, you can actually set it up so you can just click the button and go right past it. So that is an optional assessment. So if you'd like to use it, feel free. If not, you can skip right by it. Then we come to our primary victim information. You can see it already brought the name over. And then we're going to do demographics. Now you'll notice there are, again, red stars next to fields, meaning that those fields are required, but you decide which fields you want to be required. So it's up to you, whatever you would like to be required, you can make it required or not. So that way you can make sure that you are capturing the information that you need to capture or want to capture for your reporting. Right, we do have the characteristics built in. These are characteristics you find on a lot of the federal reports, so they're already built in there. We also have an area here for additional characteristics, so you can actually create your own characteristics to track. These are just examples. So you can actually track your own characteristics and have those be able to be tracked and reported on. So you have that. Okay. And you can track multiples. Classifications, again, these are on your federal reports, so they're already in here. Disabilities, you can track health insurance information if you want to. Once you've entered the primary client's information, we hit save and continue. It takes you to a shelter assessment. So if you don't have a shelter or if you don't want to do the shelter assessment, you can skip past it. Again, this was developed with our victim service clients, so all of these are questions that they wanted on a shelter form. So they all came from other victim service agencies. But again, you can fill it out or you can skip past it. You have that option in there. Then we have the household information. This is your household demographics. Again, you can decide which fields you want to be required, if any. So you can set up which fields you want to be required. Right? You can also create household characteristics. So just like we saw for the primary client, where you can create your own characteristics, you can also create household or family characteristics that you can track as well. Again, these are customizable. You can track any of those. You can also create needs. Again, these are just examples. This is all customizable. You can create different needs that you might want to track for your families as well. Right, after we fill out that, we come to the household members page. Now here you can add additional information in there. Additional household members in there. So I had a question pop up. Can CAP60 be connected to the data? I'm not familiar with that system, so we don't have a current connection to it, but we do have an API, and we're always open to connecting to other systems. So we can reach out to them, and if they would let us, we can connect to them. We do have to get their permission to connect to that, but we can connect with other databases, and we have done that in the past. So that is definitely a possibility of something we can do. We just need, again, we need their permission because that's their software. So as long as they're open to it, we can do that kind of a connection. All right, so for household members, now some agencies just track the client, and if that's what you want to do, that's fine. Click next and move on. Other agencies want to track household members like children or spouses or other people who might live in the house. And if you'd like to do that, you just click add household member and you can enter in the household member's information. Now, anybody you enter as a household member can become a client. You can give them services and they can be counted as a client if you do. So just because you enter them as a household member does not mean they can't be clients. Anybody entered in the system can become a client if you provide services to them. So it's a great way if you have multiple people, you can do them all in one intake, do a whole like a mother and two children in one intake instead of 3 separate intakes, which can definitely save time. So you can add in, again, you can add in as many household members as you would like. Then we have our offender tracking page. So if you would like to track offender information, you can do that. All of this information is optional. None of it is required. So you can track whatever information you can get. If you can't get a name, you can put them in anonymously. Again, physical descriptions, you can do vehicle descriptions. And we also have an offender search in our system. So you can enter in descriptive information and see if it matches any of the offenders in your system. So you can do those as well. And you can enter in as many offenders as you need. So if there are multiple offenders, you can enter multiple offenders. Right after our offenders is the victimization page. So here we enter in victimization information if you need it. Now there are a few required fields on here because these are things that go on the federal reports like the VOCA and VAW and stuff like that. So they are set up to be required in here. You can track primary and secondary victims, so you can track both. You can connect the offenders, so if you are tracking the offenders in the system, you can connect them directly to the victimization, and you can have up to 3 offenders per victimization, so you can track multiple offenders on a victimization. You can even set their relationship to the victim as well. And you can track the primary abuse experience. Now, this list is pulled directly from the VOCA report. If there are any kind of abuse types on this list that you do not serve, you can actually remove them from the list. So you'll only have a list of what you do serve at your agency. But you can have that list in there. You can select what the primary abuse is. Those are the required fields. After that, you can track secondary abuses if you'd like to, and you can track multiple secondary abuses. Weapons used, this is a customizable list, so you can actually create your own list of weapons if you want to say which weapons were used. Was the crime reported to the police? How long did it take to be reported? What was the police officer's name? The police department name? Who reported it? Was it the victim or someone else? And if it was someone else, what's their relationship to the victim? And then we have some check boxes down here. Again, these are things that are on federal reports. So they're built right in so you can check them off and have them automatically onto your reporting. And so you can then save in the victimization, and you can do multiple victimizations. So if the client has been victimized multiple times, you can add in additional victimizations, or if multiple people in the household have been victimized, you can enter in victimizations for different household members as well. All right, so that's the victimization section. Then we have income. Now, some agencies track it, some don't. If you don't track it, you can skip right past it. But if you do, you can just enter in the income range. You can say what their main source of income is, and then also any other income sources they might be receiving. Right, we save that, and then from there we go into services. So if you are providing services during intake, you can track those down in here. The service type, we have two categories: victim services and non-victim services. So victim services are services that are given to someone because they were the victim of a crime. A non-victim service would be services that are given to who are not victim of crimes. Pretty straightforward. The reason for the division is for reporting. There are some reports like the VOCA report. They only report on services provided to victims of crimes. They don't report on other ones. So we have that distinction in there to help with your federal reporting, your funding reporting. Right, you can say which family member is going to earn, or is not going to earn. I was going to say income. Which family member is receiving the services? If it's a victim service, which victimization is this related to? So they're receiving these services because of this victimization. You can have that connection in the system. You can choose the program and funding source that are being used. Now, these are just examples. You can actually have your own programs and your own funding sources listed in the system. These are just examples. Right? Which staff member is providing the service? If a volunteer is assisting, which volunteer is helping with the services? And then at the bottom of the page, you'll see your list of services. Again, this is just an example list. It'll be your services. You can have as many services as you want and name them whatever you want. These, again, are just examples. But you can give them multiple different services. You can give them multiples of the same service. And you can also track how much time was spent per service. Then when I save it, it's going to record those services, and it takes me to the submit page. So if everything is fine, I click submit. They are fully entered into the system, and it will even take me right into their client management, so I can continue working with them if I have to give them additional services or add them into my shelter or things like that, which we'll see as we go on. You can do those kind of things. Right? If for any reason you're not able to finish an intake, next time you look up that client, it will tell you, hey, this profile is the intake's in progress, and you can actually pick up right where you left off. So you're not going to lose any of the data that was already entered. You can just pick up where you left off and finish from there. So like I said, once I hit submit, it's going to take me into this client's client management area. You're going to notice on the white bar, some new sections will open up now that I'm working with a client. You can see I have my client name here. I have the survey section. So in here, this is where you'll find that safety assessment, the shelter assessment are in here. You can also give that to them again if you want to. We have a satisfaction survey built in. There's a custom survey tool. You can actually create your own surveys, and you can give those surveys to your clients. And we have the self-sufficiency matrix tool, which is a tool that allows you to create your own assessments. You can do custom assessments and stuff like that. So you can do all of those things. The client portal allows you to track things like additional services, household demographics, stuff like that. You can track referrals through here, all those different kinds of things. You can upload documents. We have a shelter section, so you can actually check them into your shelter, check them out of your shelter, give them items, check out items, track shelter nights, all of that stuff. Housing is the transitional housing, which is similar. You can check them into transitional housing, check them out, track all their nights in there and all that good stuff. Counseling section where you can schedule counseling appointments, track enter counseling notes, track services, those kind of things. And also a legal section for helping with protection orders, tracking protection order details, tracking cases, setting appointments with legal staff, things like that. So those are all different things you can do through the client management. I know I'm just kind of going quick, just giving you a little taste on those because, of course, I know that we're using up a lot of time here. But I just want to make sure. So these are different things you can do in here. And again, if you'd like to see a full demo, we can expand on these so you can see what we can do with all of this stuff. But we can cover all those different kinds of things. And you can also, again, upload documents, track referrals in all of these different areas. And documents can be any file you want to upload and as many as you want. We don't charge extra for that. That's all part of our service. The last thing I just want to quickly touch on, of course, is reporting. So like I mentioned, we do have a lot of the federal funding reports in here. We have the full FIPSA report built into the system. So if you get FIPSA funding, we do have this full report in here. I'm just going to quickly show a brief example just so you can kind of see. But we do have the full FIPSA report built in. The system automatically runs it. You do your normal data entry. It pulls in the numbers for you. So it takes probably like 2 or 3 minutes to run a full FIPSA. We also have the VOCA report and also the VAWA reports, the STOP report and the Muskie report. So we have all of those in here as well. So again, you just quickly enter the parameters and it pulls that report out for you. It just takes a few minutes to do that reporting. All right, so again, just kind of a quick overview of the system. If you would like to do a demonstration, please reach out, contact us. We'd be more than happy to show you all the different things our software can do and kind of go from there. So I appreciate you guys staying late, but feel free to email us or call us or even go to the website. There is a contact us page where you can ask for demos on there as well. And again, any agency that goes through a full demo with us, we will send you a Starbucks gift card, give you a little coffee on us. All right, well, thank you, Ashley. I appreciate you giving us this time to show people, and thank you, everybody who stuck around.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean. We really appreciate you showing off the CAP 60 software. And to anyone who's sticking around right now, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate it. We'll follow up with an email with more information about, of course, CAP 60, but also the resources and information that we learned today from Rachel Ramirez at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. So thank you, everyone. With that, we'll conclude today's presentation and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.